here. I believe that this is the first public event I've been involved with locally since COVID. So this is a big deal. And the fact that real people are here to listen to real words spoken is very meaningful, very gratifying. And I'm deeply appreciative. John, thank you for the idea of doing this. Thank you for your team and helping execute it. Jeff and Amy, thank you for your advocacy, your understanding. I've forged a real meaningful relationship with Shenandoah that's deeply gratifying to me personally and professionally. So this I don't take lightly. Being here is a real honor. So I appreciate everyone coming out to hear some poems. So the collection's called the Blackened Blues, and it grew. I think the best way to kind of set the tone, I mean, I would hope that the poems speak for themselves. I mean, the work always has to account for itself because you can't count on being able to explain it to an audience. But these are part of a larger project I've been working on for the last 5 years or so. And it really grew out of something that John mentioned in the introduction. I've spent a lot of time, I still do, but I had spent a lot of time as a critic. I've written a lot of movie reviews, book reviews, and a ton of music criticism. I still continue to do that, but I was really active in the early part of this century, which to say something like that shows my age. But and I loved it, and I really had built a body of, I have a passion for jazz music, kind of an ever shrinking appreciation, I think, in our culture. And I've written a lot about it, and I enjoyed writing about it. But one thing that never quite satisfied me was you have to be objective and you have to stay on point when you're writing about art of that type. And the jazz life, almost without exception, to you shouldn't bring politics into art, as George Orwell famously said. But to say that is a political statement, as Orwell said. So to say that art and politics shouldn't be one and the same is itself a political view. But when you're writing a jazz review, you're writing an essay or a criticism about a jazz album, that's really not the place to try to talk about historic racism and systems of control. So I started teasing out ways I could try to celebrate these lives and interrogate the system that a lot of these geniuses lived in and a lot of people who aren't geniuses continue to live in. And it was my way of getting inside some of these subjects. So this is definitely not a jazz book. There's a lot of jazz musicians in here because, as you'll hopefully hear, a lot of these lives are, could be made into movies because they hit on so many points that are sadly still relevant today when we talk about racism and violence and sexism. The capitalist model that is not compatible with artistic pursuits and spirituality. So I think I want to start with a poem that actually doesn't appear in the collection. I've written it since I submitted the collection, but I think it sets the tone for how I'm trying to position myself. I hope I'm not positioning myself in these poems, but I'm very cognizant that I'm a white guy with extreme privilege writing about people that had genuine struggles in their lives that I couldn't even fathom. But I understand that they need to be discussed and explored. And there's a certain anger that I hope a righteous indignation that I want to try to grapple with. So this first poem is taken from a very famous jazz song that's been covered by myriad genius artists. It's called I Loves You, Porgy, from Porgy and Bess. And I first experienced that play or store as a novel, Porgy, I think, when I was in college. So that was an early introduction into a song that I came to know through a lot of different jazz people. So there's a line in the song called I Want to Stay Here With You Forever, and that's the name of this poem. Even in the 1980s, it wasn't all bad, because in English 101, I first read Porgy and Bess, and it prepared me for some things, especially when, a few years later, Miles smiled, and I finally began to comprehend a thing or two that anthologies and college professors can never quite articulate. Words failing to explain shit like context and cause and effect. And how could summertime break my mind, then build it back up each time, reaching me in its wordless way? Then along came Nina and Ella and Billie. So by the time I got to postgrad, I knew more about Gershwin and appropriation, and how once again black artists were obliged to reclaim their culture, elevating us to places we wouldn't need to go if the American dream offered what was advertised. Words, again, talking a big game, but coming up empty in extra innings. And why I see Emmett Till and Rodney King when Sun Ra takes his solo, proving truth's always more painful than fiction because it feels real, even to not so innocent bystanders. And maybe that's why a recording from 1960 can kill me in all the right ways, suggesting something about humankind's deficiencies and redemption, and how wood, brass, and wind express what words never could. So, you see, this is what it means when I admit I don't know the blues, but I understand them. Or possibly I've got that backwards, because my ears discern what my mind can't define. So another poem that actually isn't in the collection, but was written while I've been working on these other poems. I think this is another kind of gateway into how does one talk about jazz, or how does one talk about music? I certainly face that challenge as a critic, because you have to listen to music to understand it. If you have to describe it, it just never quite works. So this poem is called Miracle on 52nd Street. 52nd Street in the 50s was where a lot of the jazz clubs were thriving, and it was really the hotbed of some of the most profound geniuses in American cultural history. And these people, as it happened, many of them couldn't even pay their rent because they were in a system that did not privilege that type of genius. So I wanted to get a handle on how bebop and this jazz music that was being made really reconfigured the way we understand our own culture. A bird blew through 52nd Street with sounds that you could see. It's not other colors, not yet. This was still black and white on every level, but deeper, darker, murky, becoming clear. Like how Eskimos have so many words for snow. Artists, too, know there's no limit on finding ways to say the same thing, different but beautiful. More, they must find new ways to sing those songs. This is how language and ideas get found. Those who can hear what they're seeing carve out a path, not bringing light to the night so much as making the blacks blanker and the whites brighter. The way the sky dances into becoming clear and small in unthinkable darkness, lit and defined by stars glowing in space, themselves impossible to see without the absence of light that causes them to shine. The sound of science creating new life out of nothing. So in John's wonderful, kind introduction mentioned that there's these poems specifically, the way they're all set up is there's a convention where there's one particular person that's interrogated or explained or celebrated, and in a handful of cases, not celebrated. But it really tries to get inside some of these individual lives, which by nature incorporates, I think, socio-political engagement and history and political statements, ways that you just can't do it with criticism. So for me, this was very liberating, trying to distill an idea or a life into a relatively short form. So I'll read a handful of tribute poems, and I think it's appropriate. I mentioned Bird. That was Charlie Parker. That was his nickname in the last poem. This is a poem about Charlie Parker. It's called Charlie Parker's Premonition. And for those of you that don't know, it's not super important, but he's generally regarded as the avatar of bebop, which led to the high point in jazz, arguably music history in America. And he struggled with a heroin addiction that took his life, I think, when he was 33. But he lived a really hard life, but left behind an unbelievable legacy. So Charlie Parker's Premonition. At least Bach believed in God. This is what saved him. Can you fathom that freedom, the peace of such certainty? Enthralled exigency, at once owned and yet refusing ownership of one's art? Accepting endowments that, on blessed occasions, override routine. On hallowed days, clamor for consummation in a voice you alone are capable of divining, or better still, chosen to channel. A commission you neither oppose nor suppress. Sadly, for the faithless, God's accessible only through transcription, and often selects vessels not spiritually suited for the exchange. How would you handle the hot urgency of some holy inspiration if it awoke inside your mind, screaming like a starved exile? Could you mitigate earthly debt in the sacred currency of psalms? Or would you require synthetic unction to abide the consecration of a million illimitable miracles, even if you scoff at such stuff? I think everyone here hopefully has heard of Billie Holiday. She was famous then. She's famous now. She'll always be famous. Another thing that I've wrestled with, I think anyone that writes about jazz, anyone that writes about art, has to resist cliche. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of these artistic lives, whether we're talking about Jim Morrison or Charles Mingus or Billie Holiday, they led troubled lives, and I think it's a cop-out to imply they led troubled lives because society was so mean and they had to seek, refuge in drugs. But the fact of the matter is, I speaking for myself, I'm no genius, and I can't fathom what it must be like to know you're a genius and not be able to pay your bills because the system is set up that you entertain people, but you can't make a living at it. I think there's a conundrum there that doesn't just apply to jazz musicians, but certainly if you were an African American in the 1940s or 50s or 60s, you had at least two things against you. And the fact that you were practicing an art form that even then had a pretty small following, it doesn't take long to go deep into a rabbit hole of despair and loneliness that I think none of us dare judge how these people fought their battles. So this next poem is called Billie Holiday's Deathbed, and it starts with a little description, which is true. On May 30th, 1959, as she lay dying at the Metropolitan Hotel in New York, aged 44, Billie Holiday was arrested, handcuffed, and put under police guard for possession of narcotics. So when you hear this poem, visualize an American genius with a bunch of white cops coming in and the indignity of handcuffing her to her bed as she died. This busy bee at the end of a life like clockwork, a symphony of service to everything but herself, wings snatched in a world blinded by the way it is, slowly expiring in the sweet nectar of silence, stung with bittersweet poison, an alchemy of blinded faith. And even this they could not abide, their white-hot burden unappeasable, like anti-gravity drawing light inside its sense of self, righteous, obdurate, enfeebled from all their inherited fears. Who are these men that know nothing about the blues, inspiring jinxed history with officious ink, corrections bled red outside the margins, ignored or overcome, their shared voice a warning, be more like me. Or worse still, stay separate, apart, unheard, entitled or at least allowed to live, strange fruit that rots inside dark spaces or gets torn down from trees, weeping their weary hymns of silence, caustic smoke signals blown from burning crosses. What do they know about beauty, their hatred the only thing honest about them? What do they know about the helpless ones? Helpless for love, helpless for song, helpless for a fix, helpless for joy, helpless for hope. God bless the child that backward men would scorn, ignore, or erase if they could. So it's not all heavy and sad. There's a gentleman who's still with us. I believe he's 90. I think he turned 90 this year. Sonny Rollins, another jazz saxophone player. Again, cliches be damned. If there were a lot of people that died young and struggled with addiction, Sonny Rollins is the antithesis of all the negative cliches. Clean, healthful, did yoga before it was cool. Again, 90, still going strong. Here's another true story about Sonny Rollins. He was already recognized in 1959 as the best saxophone player in the world. John Coltrane was coming up and breathing down his neck, but Sonny was the guy. And this poem also starts with a little paragraph of explanation, which again is true. In 1959, feeling pressured by his unexpected rise to fame, Rollins took a 3-year hiatus to focus on perfecting his craft. A resident of the Lower East Side of Manhattan with no private space to play, he took his saxophone up to the Williamsburg Bridge to practice alone. And there's actual video, there's a documentary about him. This is everything. Here's a guy that, again, was considered at that time the greatest. And, of course, didn't have private space to practice, which, what a luxury, right? He lived in an apartment, and he was the kind of guy that, didn't work 9 to 5 hours. So out of consideration for his neighbors, he went to the bridge because he knew that was where he could blow with abandon and wouldn't bother anyone. So he walked up the steps and blew his horn for 3 years. So this is called Sonny Rollins' Bridge. It wasn't his bridge, of course. It wasn't even his city. And it certainly wasn't his world. It's your world, jazz music says. I'm just living in it. And the world's a workshop. Sonny was different, though. Even for one we'd call young, gifted, and black, without being bromidic. Sonny heard so much, but mostly only listened to himself, waiting and creating his own kind of way, expressing everything. How do we describe the kind of man already in rarefied air deciding he wasn't high enough, having already eschewed the artificial ecstasy that ruins veins and soils brains, body, and soul? This colossus, keeping his own counsel, split his apartment to set up shop in the crow's nest of the Williamsburg Bridge, perhaps the one place, aside from the Arctic Circle, where no one could see or hear history being picked apart like a carcass and then reassembled in real time. 3 years of this, almost 1,000 days while the world spun, the cash registers rung, and so many pretenders to the throne ascended for lack of better options. Sun turned to snow and dawn turned to dark, and there were still all these sounds. A style being tweaked, a gift being refined, an experiment being improvised. The quest for vision, it said, will make otherwise steady men see outlandish sights. As they deprive themselves of human fuel, they become something at once less and more than a vessel. The spirits speak to them and through them, and once that barrier is broken, one sees oneself changed, then begins changing the world. So it's also not all about jazz. And as I said, there are a handful of whatever the opposite of celebration, anti-celebration for some historic figures that are richly in need of some critiques. This next poem I actually wrote at Martha's Vineyard the summer I was up there at the Noepe Center, and I was talking to John before the event, and he correctly reminded me, or asked me, we weren't always a poet. And the most or the least pretentious way I can answer is I've always written poetry, but I had written a lot of fiction and a lot of nonfiction. And I went up to Noepe to be the writer in residence with a couple of boxes full of notes for my next novel, and ended up spending 7 months writing poems, some of which are in this book, but all of which is to say, one never knows where an obsession is going to come from. But this particular poem, I was inspired by, I went to a reading, and the person had written, it was a bestseller too. I wish I could think of the name of the book, but it was basically a book about World War II and a love story like post-concentration camps. But she talked about going over to Germany to do research for the book, and she was struck by how many of the concentration camps were set in beautiful locations, like beautiful nature, and she wondered if that was intentional. And that idea stuck with me, assuming that it was intentional, adding what more, right? What more do we need to say about the Holocaust? Like, that's not fodder for art, but to think about the types of people that would imagine that they could act like God and take nature and pervert it to their own. There's too much irony in there not to explore. So this is called Himmler's First Blasphemy. And I'll resist the urge to say it speaks to contemporary events, but I don't think it's too much of a stretch to see the types of people that harken back to a world that would be better if they were in charge and could fix mistakes that have been made by the wrong people. So, Himmler's First Blasphemy. Is it possible this psychopath had a sense of humor? How else to account for those locales he chose? Unsullied landscapes, unfit for grotesque deeds, assailing nature's mise-en-scene. Or did he actually believe he was acting in accordance with a whiter god's wishes? Or worse, revamping the rough draft of a divine architect with infallible designs but insufficient resources? The Almighty alone with so many things to contend with, each second something else he was obliged to oversee or invent. We don't, after all, judge geniuses by scribbled notes left in drawers or the stalled progress of sketches dropped on laboratory floors. If not for the intrusions of bland men with honorable intentions, the red ink would be erased, a revised text enduring as the permanent record. So successive generations would learn differently and revere these consecrated sites where difficult work got done, inking black and blue numbers on arms, defiling the flesh, organizing bodies like so many library books waiting to be checked out. His aspersive vision, a new alchemy commissioned by the uncorrupted hand of history, a better future freed from abominations, begging erasure from a distracted deity, and the stern disciples willing to perfect at last the little things he lamented not making less defective the first time he tried. Who here has seen the Stanley Kubrick movie Full Metal Jacket? Pretty much everybody. This poem was actually inspired as a Winchester poem of sorts. 2 years ago, Matthew Modine, who's in that movie, came to the Alamo for a weekend, and we had the opportunity to listen to him talk about some of the movies he was in. So it was an unbelievable. So I saw Full Metal Jacket on the big screen, which I saw on the big screen in 1987 when it came out. So there was definitely a full circle. But there's a scene in that movie, which you need not have seen the movie, but basically the first half of the movie deals with boot camp. And for me, well, on its own terms, it's hugely successful because it talks about, it explores how to create a man, especially in the military, you have to break them down and break them. And so the first half of that movie is a devastating. I don't think this was necessarily the director's vision, but when I watch that movie now, I see this reflecting on so much of American society, or even just Western modern culture, this notion of masculinity and who gets to define it, who gets to enforce it, and what we do to the least powerful amongst us. that's a very long introduction for a short poem, but there is a scene in the movie where he gets what's called a blanket party. And just suffice it to say, it's a brutal bullying moment by an entire group of people larger than this room. It's a horrifying scene, and this is called Private Pile's Pain. You think soap bars and a towel hurts? Physical pain is fleeting, and scars on skin heal quicker than a soul broken by a band of brothers with darkened hearts, trained to adapt and endure, born again harder than anything you ever imagined, back in a hometown where guns killed only for food, when you could eat when hungry and sleep soundly, safely, unable to imagine monsters under your bunk bearing arms against you, disrupting dreams where baby-faced boys despair about all the things we have to destroy inside ourselves in order to survive. So, I never really thought about this till just now, but there really are two poems about two great Vietnam movies. I'm assuming a lot of people know Apocalypse Now, right? This poem, I think, as much as the jazz poems, for whatever it's worth, if someone were to ask, what are you trying to do in this collection? I've written about Apocalypse Now. Everyone's read about Apocalypse Now. Everyone's seen Apocalypse Now. But for me, writing an essay about that movie and some of the themes it touches on is just unsatisfying. The idea of trying to get inside some of the dilemmas that are handled excited me, and I'm haunted by, because I've seen the movie a lot, and there's a scene that's actually it's fascinating. I think it's a genius acting in direction, because it's actually played for comedy, but when you watch it closely, it's not funny at all. There's a scene where Chef, the ill-fated crew member, wants to go pick mangoes, and Captain Willard says, don't go alone. And he repeats the refrain, never get out of the boat, which is what they're told, don't go in the jungle. But Chef as a character is he goes in there and has a bit of a psychic break. And so it's this hilarious scene where this tiger jumps out and they run back to the boat and they're scared and they get away. But what happens in those 30 seconds as they're driving away, and you see in 30 seconds what war does to someone, or what stress does, what post-traumatic stress disorder does. And to me, it speaks volumes about the fact that, if I'm not mistaken, I should have my facts in front of me, I think more people die by suicide, more veterans die by suicide than in the war. And if that's not correct, the fact of the matter is that it's even a conversation point, I think, is its own kind of political statement. So this is a poem that imagines if Chef had lived and came back to America and what might have happened. And it's called Chef's Second Chance. It never sat well that Chef, who endured so much in the service of a suicide mission, found himself smuggled as he slept, then sacrificed like a lamb shank, collateral damage to the apocalyptic designs of Colonel Kurtz, exterminating men with the carelessness of cooks, stewing marbled meat until it sluggishly turns the color of steel pots. So let's suppose, in a slightly less insane sort of world, Chef gets a second chance. Stateside, run through the jungle, and back in his kitchen, taking orders even he can understand. Ponytail in place, primed gently by grill grease and sweat, a different cauldron altogether. Head counts and tickets clocked one plate at a time. Straight wages for sensible work. Except something's off. He can't break away from this place. Not the job, but that unconquered country and the things he carries. It couldn't break his will, but it's slowly sucking on his soul, his brain boiling with all he saw and can never not see. The more he scrubs, the less he shines. Mr. Clean, he dead. Darkness stalking his heart, murdered babies beneath his boots. Too many jobs lost to count. He's changed, but nothing else did. A survivor, but nobody warned him about anything like this. his sins can't be forgiven. Fortunate sons smirk when he stands at the bus stop. Nowhere to go, no way to pay. So of course cops come when he breaks down inside that bank. Not trying to hurt anyone. There's no gooks here, and the gun's not even loaded. Over there I could empty a clip and get myself a medal. Ain't this a motherfuck? 5 to 10 for unlawful entry? So here you are. Came all this way, and now, finally, you get it. Maybe you should have gotten your ass out of that boat. Maybe that tiger was God trying to tell you a thing or two. Too late. You'll never know now. Or else it was on a mission of its own. Finding you, afraid but still on your feet. Some instinct sending it upriver to put you, at last, out of your misery. Okay. I think it's pretty common now. I think everyone pretty much agrees that Richard Pryor is what we can now refer to as the GOAT, the greatest of all time. I think even then he was acknowledged as the best stand-up. For those of you that don't know, he also led a very troubled life for a variety of reasons. Some self-inflicted, some... to me, again, the societal pressure of being that brilliant and trying to live amongst normal people had to be a constant, challenge. But in 1980, he lit himself on fire. And at the time it was reported as an accident. He had a freebase habit, so he was not in a very good state of mind, but he was seen running down the road naked on fire. And it turned out that it was actually a suicide attempt. So this poem, to me, that incident is so ripe with metaphor about the artistic world, about struggling genius, about American society, about where does genius come from and how is it handled. And this actually gave me, I grew up a Catholic and was an altar boy, so I'm at least conversant with some scripture. So this poem has a little fun with juxtaposing this notion of divine genius and the sins of the flesh, and it is called Richard Pryor's Flesh. Take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. How many times did we hear that back in the day? This cup is the new covenant of my blood. In remembrance of who? Which way is up? The light shines in the darkness. Do you see the light? And the darkness has not overcome it. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. The church was our school and vice versa. Both things we outgrew as we grew out of everything they beat into us. So many switches swinging in the winter wind, breaking our backs because this hurts you more than it does me. Thy will be done. Cast them into the furnace of fire. Now we're talking. Every man who tells the truth has to take the heat. Face it, eat it, bathe in it, and pour lighter fluid on the flames. This is just what a genius does. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering. You see, the gods demand abnegation, their alms. Mere mortals can put cash in the basket, but certain sorts of men pay a different way. The kind of currency that leaves singed skin and scars. That's the price of admission. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. How? Bodies are only boats surrounded by the spirits. Why? If you have to ask, you'll never know. Prove you mean it. That means you're real. This life only hurts because you're alive. So we got time for one more. My feeling is always less is more. Leave them wanting more instead of going too long. I had two more to read. Are we feeling like we've got two more in us?
Go for it.
All right. I want to end on a somewhat upbeat note. These poems aren't all depressing. I'm reading as I'm reading these. The first poem in the collection is about Charles Bukowski. And I'm a English major, got my MA in literature. I was trained correctly, and I was always told that, Bukowski was a joke. He was a cliche. He was a buffoon. He was, a false machismo, all of which is true. But one thing I admire about Bukowski, having read his work, is that dude got up every day and did the work. He wasn't part of the industry. He wasn't beholden to any publisher. He didn't get any perks. And yeah, he was a dude. I mean, he got in bar brawls and did the Hemingway thing. But the more poetry I read, the more truth I find in some of his poems and his genuine concern with the human condition. When I read poems now that talk about, lofty, like I feel like in 2021, we don't have the luxury to talk about love. We have to talk about love, and love is everything. But when I read poems that are getting their Shakespeare on, I'm like, 2021, we can't afford to use poetic language to write poetry. So I treasure Bukowski for keeping it real. He's not one of my favorite writers, but boy, is he an interesting subject. So this is called Charles Bukowski's Bounty, and it might explain why I'm not standing in front of a classroom and I didn't go down a certain path. Maybe I've got a little bit of a chip on my shoulder. You could write a poem about this. That was the story of his life, the story of his stories. Something more authentic than life, which is what art can be. Failure, a half-empty amphitheater where ideas are born. Anyone can orchestrate chaos, but it takes guts to own it, even if you can't describe or explain it. And between spilled beers and bruised hands, there's a question. What kind of world would you create, even if you couldn't? Take that mattress out in the street. Second-hand salvation for those disinclined to inquire, but unafraid to inherit. In this part of town, everyone knows shit you throw into a dumpster doesn't go there to die. There's always someone hungrier or less happy, someone who will not go quietly into that precarious night, grateful to have the things you no longer need. Those women were not unlike the poems and stories. They were the gold you spun from the machine we call misfortune, or being brave enough to figure out you own time even when you can't make money. Money and time own you unless you can flip the script, sucking the sweetness life lets you steal when it's looking the other way. Content to sleep or screw or imagine better realities, lying on a sullied mattress, unworried by their stains or the untruths they could tell, contaminating you in unintended ways because we share everything anyhow, the ugliness most of all. And miserable men become mice, scurrying away from that evidence, scared to reconcile the ways we made these fictions of ourselves in our own likeness way before the world ever got involved. And that's why well-fed and wordless sheep pace silently inside extravagant pens, erected to secure them from all the surprises cops and cars and banks and Bibles can't protect or serve. Or prevent the moon from sweet-talking the tides to turn, or the sun setting without comment over shallow graves dug with dirty fingernails, bleeding insolently onto dry clean suits, symphonies of all the seconds and cents spent, hoping to hide the sick and satisfied smile of a universe that will throw all of us, ultimately, into immaculate recycling bins where, once we die, starving saints turn us into stories and poems. Thank you. I'd love to. If there are any questions or comments or complaints addressed to John, and sure.
How many revisions does the poem go through?
That's a great question. It does vary in my experience. When I was at Noepe that summer, I would usually spend, I would work on a poem till it was ready. And so that could be a morning or a day or a week. or occasionally you just put it away and return to it. Or I think, and this is advice I give anyone, it certainly served me well, even when it's done, before you send it out or before you think it's ready for the world, looking at it with fresh eyes a week or a month or a year later, you'll pick up on the words you used twice or the turn of phrase that doesn't quite work. I've found, and again, I don't know if there's any unpretentious way to say this, but when I was writing a lot of criticism, and I guess it stands to reason, right? I'm sure this is true of athletics, of any endeavor. The more you do something, you do kind of get into a groove, and you learn certain shortcuts, so you're able to access what you're going for, in a more efficient way. So when I was writing reviews, I mean, when I first started doing that, it would be exhausting, and it would take me a lot of drafts to write 1,000 words, like an inordinate amount of time for free work, frankly. Similarly with poems, I've found that as I've written more of them, I trust that first instinct more, and I want to keep and retain some of that freshness so that they don't feel overwritten. So there are some poems I've written that have come quicker, maybe partly because I've kind of accessed that, what I'm trying to do, but I also I don't trust something that has been fussed over too much. And I don't know what the ideal balance is there. I think you just know when a poem isn't right, when it's not cooked. You got to keep it in the oven. But when it feels right, I've learned to kind of trust that, you got to move on to other things. I think you can really get caught up on obsessing over a particular piece, and you might suck some of the life out of it. And also it's keeping you from doing other stuff. So, but suffice it to say, very, very seldom like first draft and is done. I've noticed when I came of age, and until really recently, I never composed on a computer. And I had this kind of old school pride. Like, I write on legal pads, and I was taught, like, you need to earn putting it into the computer. Like, once you put it in a computer, it looks professional, and you can kid yourself into thinking it's done. I've learned that you have to trust your own. Like, it does look done. Like, when a legal pad, you're still crossing things out, and it's just not there. On a computer, but it's also easier with poetry to edit and make changes. And so I think part of it is just learning to trust your own voice. And really, sometimes they come and it's amazingly quick, and you just feel so lucky. And sometimes, I've got a bunch of half-written drafts that are just, I can't crack them. And maybe I'll get to them, or maybe they're just not meant to be written.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
A troublemaker in the back.
Yes. It is so cool to have read your work and hear you read it. This is the first time I've heard you read. And as I'm listening to you read these, I'm recalling reading them. And they're quite lyrical. When you compose your poetry, do you do it out loud? And so do you verbalize it and think about how it sounds to the, because most people are not going to hear you read it, they're going to read it written. So is that a part of your method?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, Jeff. Full candor, just about every poet I've ever read an interview with will swear that you write poems to read them and they need to be read. And I'm the opposite. I write poems that need to be read. I feel like even tonight, like there's certain turns of phrase or there's some punning and with some of these characters, right? I don't think again, my personal opinion is a work has to stand on its own, so you have to like leave some breadcrumbs. But like if you've read Apocalypse Now, or if you've seen Apocalypse Now, or have read Heart of Darkness, like that poem has some in jokes and I think it conveys when you say it out loud. But I've always been a little more self-conscious about the word choices and less about the fluidity of, so I think you want to try to read your work clearly and effectively. And I can't have an opinion on that, because anytime I see myself on camera, I think any normal person hears or sees himself and is appalled. So I would call myself a mediocre poetry reader, but when I write the stuff, I'm much more concerned about how it's going to be read. But I do think that makes me a minority, because again, I've seen so many people say, I can't even stand people to read my poems. I need to recite them. And I have no judgment on that, but I find that a little bit spurious. I don't buy that. Poetry is meant to be read aloud, right? It's an oral tradition, but I think the beauty of the words, like the poetry I like best, I don't feel cheated that I don't get to hear so and so read their work, but it's a revelation when you do hear a certain poet that you admire to do that. So it's an interesting thing, but I guess I'm less concerned with reading it.
Anyone else? Going once, twice?
I guess that.
A lot of musicians, or sometimes artists, visual artists, will say their creations are something that they discover, that come to them. And so I wonder, as a poet, do you feel that your art is a discovery more than a creation, or the opposite?
God, that's a great question. I think so. For me, like what I call this project, right? Again, there's just no way to not sound pretentious, but these poems are part of more poems that use this strategy, and I think without exception, they are people that I know, very well. Like they're artists or lives that I'm deeply familiar with. So I'm able to drop, biography and at times, and I hope judiciously, drop in cultural commentary or irony, talking about something that happened 100 years ago that really talking about today. Like the Himmler poem, I don't know if it's successful in that regard, but it's talking about the concentration camps, but I think it's also alluding to this seemingly recurrent obsession of, powerful men wanting to recreate the world in their image. But so sometimes it'll be as simple as one of the poems in this collection is about Charles Mingus, jazz genius. And I was in the car one day and a song that I really like by him came on. And I just started writing the poem in my head. And so I think some of it is like the energy is there and the knowledge is there. It's just trying to find a way into what it is. So for me, and I'd be curious what all the writers in here have experienced, whether I'm writing a short story or a poem, often it's like the first line or a line, and that is what will draw me in. And then I need to make sense out of how do I either continue that, or if it's the last line, which is seldom, like how do I get to that point? What do I need to do to get there? And that usually involves a longer, talking about someone's life, my first draft will get it all down and it's not really poetic. And then you start to narrow it into something that, has a little bit of bite. So I want to try to give you an honest answer. Like, I think there is discovery. I definitely didn't set out and say, here are the 30 artists I'm going to write poems about, and then I wrote them. Some of this, it really is a function of, on a given day. So for instance, that Himmler, the poem, that really did come out of an author talking about the book she wrote, but it just struck me that she talked about these beautiful locations and how she actually had some guilt. Like, I was taking pictures that weren't just about like the camps, like they were in these beautiful locations, and that got me thinking. I think I must have either seen Apocalypse Now for the 100th time, but just started thinking about, how do we talk about Vietnam veterans or veterans of any war, and in a way that you're not on your soapbox talking about how horrific our society is. Like I think there's ways to kind of creatively get inside that, but there is politics in there. It's just not explicit.
I think sort of with writing and sort of getting constructive criticism is like a big value. It's something I get a lot of value out of. I was wondering, could tell a time where you got constructive criticism that was valuable but just gutting.
You got all night? Yeah, I think any rejection is a form of criticism. Not being able to get, like, I've not published a lot more work than I've published, and there's kind of an inherent something either isn't clicking or it hasn't met the right editor, or but to answer your yes, for sure, whether it was in a workshop setting, having sensitive, intelligent people give feedback, the kind of questions people will ask. But I do think for the best gift I think a writer develops is at some point after doing it, and it gets into that whole, another cliche, but the whole at 20,000 hours and you do something, you're going to gain a facility. I certainly don't buy into if you do anything for 20,000 hours, you're going to be great at it. But I also think it's safe to say if you do something for 20,000 hours, unless you're not trying to learn, you're going to pick up certain strategies and you're going to learn how to avoid certain mistakes. Somewhere in my 30s, I developed enough of an internal critic where I knew that it didn't matter if it got published. If it didn't scratch a certain itch, it was not meant for the world. So there was no temptation to let work that didn't seem right into the world, even if it was going to be warmly embraced. So I think I internalized so much criticism I'd received in my younger writing life, and by reading a lot in a weird way, that also is like when I read something really good, to me that's an inherent criticism because I'm like, how did that person do that? I can't do that. And how do they do that so consistently? What does it entail? But I feel like I owe you a specific example. It's tricky because when I say rejection, I mean like rejection from literary magazines and editors and agents, because once you've published enough stuff, you're pretty much showing it to your friends. And I think most friends, for very understandable reasons, just don't want to go there and give you an honest opinion, which is another reason that you have to trust your own. Like, I just think a writer knows, and I'm curious if everyone disagrees, like, you want it to work, but you know if it's just not ready. And I think the writers that succeed on some level are able to resist the temptation of sending it out into the world before they know they feel good about it. So that, at least in my case, with the tons of rejection I've had, it stings less if you feel good about a piece. You just figure it'll find its audience at some point, or even if it doesn't, it was worth writing this because I felt like I got it. So there's certain poems I've written, before they got published and before this became a book. There definitely are certain poems in there where I felt I don't ever have to write about this topic again because I got it. Doesn't mean I thought it was great, but just I don't have to revisit that because I feel like I was able to achieve what I wanted to achieve. So to me, that then becomes kind of the bar that I have to pass to feel good about it. I still feel like let me think some more because I'm not trying to avoid. Believe me, I've gotten constructive criticism, and it's always. And I think to me, maybe the most important thing I would say is anyone that's not open to being critiqued, I don't think is taking the craft seriously because I just don't think anyone is that good. When I read, the critical editions of famous novels, and you see the works in progress, or when I started buying CDs, again, aging myself, but these days you get the bonus edition and you get all the rough cuts. And to me, it's always instructive, whether it's the Beatles, a jazz musician, whomever, and you hear the early drafts and they suck. And you realize even the geniuses didn't get into the studio and get it down on the first try. So to me, that never discourages me. That makes me feel better. Like, God, even the geniuses have a hard time, or it takes work. And it doesn't usually just flow right out. I find something really beautiful about that because it reminds us that we're all human, and there's no real, I don't think there's any secret. There's no shortcut. You just got to do it. Yeah.
On a similar note, as a writer, how do you feel like you get around forcing creativity? I'm like, working with poetry, but I know simply done it when I felt like an extreme urge to write. I was wondering how you manage to write if you never don't necessarily have an extreme urge to pursue something.
So, if you read books about writing, you'll read the whole gamut of, there are the writers that are like, you have to have a pad, you get up at 6 a.m., I go for a 3-mile run, and then I come in and I write for 3 hours, and then I have coffee. Writers will say, I have coffee and check my email, and then I write. Everything in between. I think the reality is, no matter what you're trying to achieve, I think it's safe to say that being inspired is great. I don't think it happens that often. Forcing yourself to write is usually not going to yield the results you want, but you've got to find some balance where you have to set some deadlines, and you do have to write poorly to write well. And I've written a lot, and I still struggle with, I don't want to write crap, I want it to work right. And I think this quote has been attributed to a lot of people, but I love it. Whoever first said it is, I hate writing, but I love having written. And I certainly can relate to that. It's like working out. I never look forward to it, but I usually feel a little bit better about myself after I do it. So I am not going to be one that espouses like, you got to have a pattern and you got to, write 5 poems a week. But there is something usually good that comes out. I do believe that if you write, without thought, and it usually isn't good, you're getting some of that out of your system, and it helps take you in a direction you might not have even thought about. But for me, there's usually some germ of an idea. Like I don't usually sit down with a blank piece of paper and go, I have no idea what I'm going to write about today. Like that I'll say is rare for me. And I think most of us with lives, that's where you hopefully get that kind of balance of, I don't have to worry about this during the workday or when I'm trying to sleep, but there does have to be some time for creativity. Or if an idea comes, you got to be willing to turn the TV off or, cancel that date and appreciate, I've pulled over in the car many times knowing that moment might pass, or woken up in the middle of the night with a line. And sometimes I fail at this, right? Because you're warm and when the muse or whatever comes, respecting that, saying that's a jump start, and sometimes it works. You get that line down and then you wake up in the morning and you can return to it and it's in there. So I would say writing more is better, but I am definitely not the guy that's going to say, every day you got to put in 2,000 pages or 2,000 words or whatever. I think different things work for different people. I have writer friends that write really slowly. The guy that I went up to Noepe with and ran the center with, he is the opposite of me. He thinks I'm, a maniac because I can churn out some work, but he really agonizes over his poems, and that's just his personality. I admire that. He's not doing it to be that guy. Everything he does is deliberate. He's talks slowly. He thinks deeply. That works for him. I don't think it would work if you tried to be more productive. So, but I also find reading always helps, right? I mean, that's like the easiest answer. But for me, if I'm feeling like trapped, reading is always inspiring because I just see how it's done, and something good usually comes out of that.
Any other questions? No, I think we're good. All right.
Well, I appreciate everyone coming out, hanging in there. It's fun. It's humbling to read to someone that is interested in hearing what you have to say. So very appreciative. And, if anyone, I think we can put info, if anyone has questions or wants to talk more, you can get my info. I'd be delighted to talk about any of this stuff anytime.
Right on.
Do you have copies of that?
That's
I
my-
do. I've got some books. So they sell for $15.